From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
I think for Blaise, spying was the only job that she ever wanted, and she managed to get hold of an Osborne spycraft manual from her older brother, and she's spoken about crossing out his name on the inside cover and writing hers in its place.
Blaise Metreweli will soon be the first female boss of MI6.
And she also has talked about her and her friends learning Pigpen code, which is this cipher system replacing letters with symbols. And her friends would leave notes for each other under flower pots.
She's been a spy in the shadows for decades, but will soon be in the one public-facing job in the whole place. She will be C. Think Judi Dench in the recent Bond films.
You don't like me, Bond. You don't like my methods. You think I'm an accountant. A bean counter, more interested in my numbers than your instincts.
The thought had occurred to me.
Good. Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War. Whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
Blaise Metreweli takes over in the autumn as Sir Richard Moore steps down.
Courageous men and women from other nations choose to make common cause with us, often at immense risk. Recruiting and running those agents in the toughest and most inhospitable places on Earth is what we do. That is our core business. We have to maintain secrecy, not as an end in itself, but because the lives of our agents and the effectiveness of our work depend upon it.
The story today: who is the new C?
I met her a few years ago at an event at MI5, and you can't really talk about the details of that event because obviously it was all off record and we weren't able to name her at the time. But she was pretty impressive and really confident, really interesting and gripping, and you wanted to listen to her. I'm Larisa Brown. I'm the defence editor at The Times. She went to a drinks event that I was at more recently, and she obviously liked talking to journalists and giving us her perspective on what the intelligence services were doing at the time. And I felt like she was going to get the job months and months ago. I mean, probably even, over a year ago. And so when they announced her name, I wasn't surprised at all. Blaise joined the service in 1999, and what makes her quite interesting is that she'll be the first chief that didn't actually serve during the Cold War period.
Interesting. So she's a sort of new, younger generation, and actually quite young herself, only 47, with this amazingly big job. We've mentioned how she's going to be the first female C, the first female boss of MI6. I wonder, what do you think is different about a female spy or a female boss of spies as opposed to a load of blokes doing it?
She's talked in the past about the difficulties, but also the benefits of being a woman in the field. And she's mentioned previously about how with men, obviously she doesn't want them to get the wrong idea. And she's brought in terminology that might help build those relationships by saying things like, I feel like I'm your sister, or I can imagine you being my brother, and I really respect you as my father. And that clearly worked for her. She did manage to build that rapport with men. And obviously the benefit of being a woman also meant that women would talk to her. Now, in some cultures, it'd be more difficult for those women to speak to a male officer, and that is where she would have been able to build a rapport with females especially. And obviously don't forget that in this world of spycraft, you've got to be able to develop those relationships with females as well as males.
I'm Dr. Dan Lomas. I'm an assistant professor in international relations at the University of Nottingham, and I research on the UK's intelligence and security community. Primarily, my work at the moment is researching the history of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS.
The new C, Blaise Metreweli, the new boss of MI6, what do we know about her?
So we actually know quite a lot beyond the government press statement that was released earlier this week. We know that she joined SIS, MI6, in 1999. She had been an undergraduate of anthropology at Cambridge. She has served in the Middle East and Europe, and she is head of SIS's Q branch, which is the sort of geeky, technical aspect of what SIS does.
Ben Whishaw in the Bond films, not to trigger you.
Well, yes.
007.
Q?
Please excuse the mess. Everything's a little bit up in the air, what with the changes and all.
So her as boss of Q branch, is she, doing exploding pens and cars that go underwater?
There is an aspect of what Bond picks up on. So the Q branch, for listeners, there'll be exploding sandwiches, phone boxes that go bang, cars with machine guns in, and that's in the Bond universe. There's an element of borrowing from a wartime organisation called SOE, Special Operations Executive, where they are experimenting in weird and wonderful stuff. And sorry if anyone listening is grossed out by this, but they do use stuff like carcasses of dead rats and hollow them out and put plastic explosive in them. The idea that there's lots of dead rats in factories. How do you utilise this and create paranoia? Well, you turn it into an exploding rat by putting plastic explosive literally into the rat with a time pencil stuck up its bum. Then this will blow up and destroy stuff. It creates then paranoia that, oh my God, every rat out there potentially is an exploding rat. That's not what modern day Q branch is getting up to. So Q branch, or SIS's Directorate of Technology and Innovation, to kind of be the boring pedant about this, is engaged more to do with supporting what SIS does on a day-to-day basis, which is the recruitment of foreign nationals to spy for the UK government, particularly around communication. So how do you message with an agent in a foreign country without risking their life?
And isn't Blaise Metreweli on the record somewhere saying she's a fan of brooches, but people always assume there's a camera in them or something like that?
Yeah, so she was remarkably candid in a 2022 piece in the FT where she describes herself as a geek. And yeah, there is suspicion about some of the brooches that she apparently wears where people think, wow, there's a listening device in there. And she talks about paranoia about that.
What is the blend of skills that she brings to the job?
When you're looking for a really good intelligence officer, you're looking for someone who is an extrovert, someone who can hold a chat, someone who can engage with other individuals, someone who's interesting, someone who can become involved in speaking to different groups of people.
Someone who knows all too well about this is Dame Stella Remington, who was the first female boss of the other intelligence service, MI5.
The training course that existed in those days to teach us the skills we needed to deal with these human sources was geared entirely for men, because it was about going into a pub and using some kind of cover story about who you were and what you were doing. And we're talking here about the mid-1970s. I was given my pub, went in there, surveyed the pub full of men in dirty Macs leaning on the bar, drinking pints, went up and chatted up one of these guys who was very surprised by this approach from a seemingly respectable lady. And so that was the beginning of my career as what we call an agent runner.
When you're looking for someone who becomes an intelligence officer, who then rises through the ranks of the service, who completes the various overseas assignments that you need and then move into the higher echelons of the service, that's the kind of career profile that you want. Someone who's been there, done that, got the T-shirt as an agent handler, but someone who can get on with other individuals, who can be a team player. That's kind of the skills that you want.
And do we know where she has applied some of those skills in her long career in the intelligence services? Because it's MI5 and MI6 that she's worked at.
Yeah, so in terms of the operational career, it's been described officially as her operating in the Middle East. She's a fluent Arabic speaker with interest across the region. She's also worked in Europe. To be clear, the service, given the sensitivities of what an SIS officer is engaged in, the recruitment of a foreign national, We don't specifically know where she has served overseas to protect the identities of some of the agents that she talks about. She talks about the experience of being an intelligence officer and running an agent overseas and meeting an agent, and to protect their identities long term. We don't specifically know where she's served, but we do know that she has broader experience of the UKIC, the UK intelligence community. So she has worked with SIS's sister service, the security service, or MI5. And again, this is one of, when you were asking before about the key skills, one of the key skills of a chief of SIS is to, yes, represent their service, but also work in a collegiate manner with other aspects of the UK intelligence community. And it's that kind of skill, again, that made her, yes, the internal candidate for the job, but someone who, yes, is internal but has broader experience and able to work across government, marketing intelligence to the rest of Whitehall or liaising with other parts of government.
Do we know how that might be different for a woman? A lot is made of her being the first female C. Would she bring something different? Is the job slightly different if you are a woman?
Let's be clear, women have always formed a key part of the UK intelligence community. However, their roles have often been marginalised when it comes to the types of jobs that they often went into. So for much of the history of SIS, women have performed vital backroom roles. They've supported frontline activity. They've often been posted overseas as secretaries and sometimes been involved in frontline activity. But there were a whole range of issues regarding sort of a marriage bar on women progressing in the service, kind of halted career pathways. As a female intelligence officer, yes, there are in the 1990s still some of the legacy from what's happened before. Women still are a rare breed when it comes to intelligence officers, the IO type role. Richard Moore, the current C, has done quite a lot to encourage women within the service, and the service has made a clear effort to develop a talent pipeline of women from entrance to the service all the way through to the senior ranks. But I think in terms of that PR side of things, we are going to see a different type of chief.
Back to Dame Stella.
If you think about it, some of the skills you need to deal with human beings who are often in difficult and dangerous situations requires just those skills that we talk about nowadays as the female skills: warmth, empathy, the ability to encourage and bring people along, an understanding of people, and a certain degree of ruthlessness, which I think is also a female quality.
Dan, are there benefits to being a woman as an intelligence officer? Just thinking about that FT interview that she gave, although not under her own name, a couple of years ago, she's quoted as saying, being visibly pregnant can stimulate unusual conversations. Some of the hardest negotiators have softened talking about their hopes for their own children or the next generation.
Yes, one of the cliches I often talk to students about is that when you watch Bond or you watch kind of anything that is to do with women and intelligence on the silver screen, the image often is a femme fatale kind of Mata Hari-like figure. That is certainly not the case. When it comes to being an IO, and I talked about some of the skills before, to be able to engage with people, to speak, to seem normal, to engage in conversation, being a woman can be seen to be disarming. There is a perception that SIS is still an organisation dominated by the chaps. And, being a woman allows you to just engage in conversation. You can be mistaken for a casual member of the Foreign Office or someone who's living overseas within an embassy. So you're not seen as, an SIS officer, even though you are.
Let's rewind on some of the history of MI6, SIS. When did it even start?
Yeah, we're going back to 1909, the early part of the 20th century. SIS emerges out of an organisation called the Secret Service Bureau. So back in 1909, the UK government decides for the first time to create this organisation as a screen between agents overseas who want to give information to Britain and the UK government, so it provides plausible deniability. And literally in the early days, it is an eclectic guy called Mansfield Cumming.
He seems crackers, the first head of the service.
Yeah, so Cumming sets up the service, and there's a lot of mythology around him. We know a lot through his diaries, but in terms of kind of descriptions, I mean, he lives this weird life where he's involved at the time in driving fast cars. He likes aeroplanes. He likes potions. He's using false noses. He's using false beards. He's kind of a master of disguise.
Is it true that on his desk the photos were just photos of himself in different disguises?
So there are various descriptions of his desk. There's revolvers left on the side, there's knives. Everything you associate with a spy in the popular world is kind of on his desk. There's mystique about how he does this, but there's a car crash in 1914 where he loses his leg. Mythology suggests that he cuts his own leg off with a penknife to take care of his dying son in the car crash. Others would say he just loses his leg. But from then on, he enjoys going around SIS's various headquarters in a kind of buggy, sometimes in the middle of an interview, stabbing his false leg with a knife just to see the reaction of people in the room. So he kind of lives up to the mythology-like stuff. There is kind of a crossover with the modern-day service and Cumming. So the title of Chief, C, originates from the Cumming era. He writes letters, or he signs off in green ink, which comes back to some of the naval traditions of the early SIS. And there's a grandfather clock within the service's headquarters at Vauxhall Cross that Cumming creates whilst he's doing spying against Germany at the start of the 20th century. He's also doing kind of craftsmanship and this kind of stuff. So he's a very kind of eclectic individual.
How does the service grow then from that Cumming era?
So 1914 war breaks out. The service has already started to expand pre-war and is running networks in Germany against particularly German naval targets. But really during the First World War, it's conducting espionage activity across the Middle East. You're conducting operations in Russia, which initially is an ally, and then post-Bolshevik revolution is seen as a target for intelligence work. You're also running agents in neutral countries, so Switzerland. The next period really is the Second World War. The war breaks out in 1939. The collapse of France, Belgium, Holland in May 1940 forces SIS to rethink how it works and how it operates. It literally has very few agents operating in occupied Europe for the early part of the Second World War. And as a result of this, SIS is working with Allied governments in exile, the French, the Free French, the Belgians, the Dutch, individuals in sort of the Scandinavian countries, and it begins to build up its networks. And I'd say, a lot of listeners may have heard of Bletchley Park and the significant contribution that Bletchley makes to helping win the Second World War. SIS's contribution is much more nuanced. Much of its work is behind the scenes. It doesn't attract the same limelight as Bletchley does, but it is able to recruit a vast number of networks throughout occupied Europe, but also in neutral countries, in the Far East, across the Middle East. It's able to recruit large numbers of individuals who are risking everything to support the Allied cause during the Second World War. And then, we get into the early Cold War period, and the tensions with Britain's former wartime ally, the Soviet Union, lead to the large organisation that we see today. There are reports in the early 1950s that SIS has 1,500 staff. So it's becoming a large organisation at that point. And then throughout the Cold War, SIS is providing significant amounts of information from behind the Iron Curtain on what the Soviet Union and its satellite countries are doing. Initially, it's very hard work. So the move from Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union is a significant problem. SIS has a lot of trouble in recruiting and running agents in a totalitarian police state. There are a large number of, let's say, failures, not helped by the fact that the service is penetrated as well by, some of the listeners might be familiar with a guy called Kim Philby, who's a high-profile SIS officer working for the KGB, or Russia's intelligence service at the time.
Do you have any other reason for keeping silent, Mr. Philby?
I have. The efficiency of our security services can only be impaired if their organizations and techniques are discussed in public.
So some of the early activity of SIS is undermined by all this. By the late 1950s, early 1960s, they are starting to have significant successes. And it's estimated that during the Cold War, there's something in the region of 40 to 80 agents that are run, high-level agents within Eastern Bloc governments providing information.
Amazing.
And the service really has then a string of success, and it kind of lays the origins really of the modern-day service.
As we look through the history in the 20th century of MI6, is there one sort of like standout Blaise Metreweli equivalent working through those years?
The trailblazer really around this is Daphne Park, Baroness Park, who, over the years has been quite open, or was quite open, about her role for the service, working in Moscow in the 1940s, 1950s as an intelligence officer.
I and my particular friends were all interviewed and offered jobs in the Treasury and places like that. And we had seen ourselves running the entire war and preferably driving submarines, so we turned all this down with great contempt.
She's also working, across Africa at a time of British imperial decline, post-independence. She's working as an intelligence officer in the Congo in a difficult operational environment. And then later, she's working in Southeast Asia. She's an intelligence officer in North Vietnam. And she's also a trailblazer when it comes to kind of the heights that women reach within the service. And she's seen as, a formidable, trailblazing individual, an officer with great resource and daring at times. And, there's many echoes between her and I think, the profile of Blaise and others out there.
Back to Blaise Metreweli. What does her appointment, do you think, tell us about how the powers that be see MI6's future and what's required?
So I think that the key thing to take from this is the technology dimension of this. You've appointed, head of Q to become C. So what's the significance of this? Well, these days to run an agent in a hard target, Russia, China, Iran, countries where there is a serious counterintelligence, they're seriously good at counterintelligence and quite ruthless. You have to use technology as part of your running of an agent. So potentially using fake websites, using social media, using chat rooms, using devices. And Blaise has actually gone on record to say that some of the stuff they're doing in Key Branch is how to hide not explosives in everyday objects, but how to hide microphones, communication devices, that kind of stuff within everyday items. You're thinking, how do you run and recruit an agent in the 21st century? What are the things you need to do? And I'd say, the age of the spy is, not dead. It is certainly not dead. In fact, it's enhanced by how you use technologies.
My teams are now using AI to augment, but not replace, their own judgment about how people might act in various situations. They're combining their skills with AI and bulk data to identify and disrupt the flow of weapons to Russia for use against Ukraine. In future, as AI begins to overtake some aspects of human cognition, it's possible that digital tools may come to understand, or rather to be able to predict, human behavior better than humans can. But there will always be an extraordinary bond that allows one person genuinely to confide in another, united by a sense of common humanity and purpose, the essence of the human factor.
So that, I think, is the key takeaway.
You will always need those personal connections, but there's an increasing need for technology to make that possible.
Yeah, satellite images are great for telling you what might be happening in a geographical location. As to what's happening maybe in a building, you need a human source to go in there and get that types of information. I also think the first female C sets an important precedent in terms of who you want to recruit to the service, who you want to attract, and the range of talents, and that you want SIS to reflect modern society. And some people out there, again, would suggest that this is, I hate this period, the term woke. Let's be clear, it's not wokeness. This is to do with operational requirements. The service needs women, people from different underrepresented groups of British society, because they bring key skills to the table in terms of linguistics, representation, that kind of stuff. And I think it sets an important precedent in that way as well. Yeah. She's talked a lot in her interviews about being a mother as well, and normalising being a mother and working as an intelligence officer. Talking about being pregnant overseas and some of the interesting conversations that provokes. Also, I believe that the first person within the service to ask how do you fix an ISOFIX car seat into an armoured vehicle. So again, someone who's not afraid to challenge kind of norms and be a trailblazer in that area as well. And again, it comes back to this idea that it's a normal, it's a normal individual. So I think again that sets a different trajectory really on what SIS sees itself as and how it interacts with British government and also society. We've gone post 9/11. From a service when Blaise just joins back in 1999, 2001 is a pivotal moment for the UK intelligence community, and it signifies a shift towards counterterrorism as the major remit for what the agencies do. And now we're seeing a move back again towards that state-based threat capability that we were seeing during the Cold War. The problem, however, is that terrorism hasn't suddenly gone away. Terrorism remains a imminent threat to the UK, and it remains one where it has immediacy. If a terrorist incident happens, then the accusation is that the agencies have failed. But we're now starting to see that move back to the slow burn threat of Russia, Iran, China.
The classics.
And the service is, going to be both overstretched. It remains a global service, but there is that tension between, where do you put your resources?
I think the fact that Blaise obviously was Q and is Q at the moment is really important, because I think that speaks to the fact that MI6 is going to have to go through a real period of change and is doing already, in order to make sure that they can still recruit officers, that they can still get agents on side, they can still travel abroad and obviously meet the people that they need to and get secrets. And that's all becoming a lot harder with things like facial recognition. You go to an airport and even if they have a fake passport, then they'll probably be able to find out who they are, and that's a problem. And that is something that spies and former spies have shared with me quite recently.
Leafing through what we do understand about her, she is a real true believer in the cause.
She is, and it was really interesting because somebody interviewed her and she got out from her ID lanyard a quote that she was carrying, a piece of paper with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. And that quote said, "Who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly." And I think that pretty much sums up her character, doesn't it?
Larisa Brown, defence editor at The Times. And we also heard from Dan Lomas, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Nottingham. That is it from us today. The producer was Shabnam Grewal, the executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition was by Mao Lassetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.